Hail and welcome to the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes and so glad that you're here with me today. This, my friends, is the last episode of 2018. A new season will begin in February and run another 13 episodes, taking us through the final throes of winter and into the spring. Keep in mind my new podcast, Minnesota's Most Notorious, Where Blood Runs Cold, will not take a break. More stories and more interviews over there for the next couple of months, if you are so inclined. Remember, you can also become a patron at patreon.com, patreon.com/Most Notorious, and get ad-free episodes delivered straight to you from both of my shows, plus other cool stuff as well. So on to the show. We haven't done a serial killer episode in a while, but today we've got one for you, and as it turns out, possibly the most famous one in the history of France. So without further ado, let's begin. It's with great pleasure that I introduce journalist and author Richard Tomlinson. His newest book is called Landru's Secret, The Deadly Seduction of France's Lonely Hearts Serial Killer. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Pleasure.
What an interesting subject matter. I mean, honestly, I'd never heard of this case before I picked up your book. Where did you first learn about the Landru case?
Well, it was a long time ago, in the early 1980s, when I was a student in Paris studying for a PhD in modern French history. And somebody said to me, because I was looking in particular at attitudes to women in the early 20th century in France, and they said, you should really look at the Landru case. And I'd never heard of him either. And I went to the newspapers and looked up his trial, which was in 1921. And it was absolutely saturation newspaper coverage, which mercifully is all online now. And the thing that really intrigued me was the first day, or actually it was the second day, because they read out the indictment and various other things on the first day, when they got to the first of 10 women he was alleged to have killed. And I looked at this case and I thought, this really just doesn't make sense, because she was a seamstress called Jeanne Couchet, living in fairly straitened circumstances in Paris, single mother with a teenage boy. And her brother-in-law said that she was worth, in modern money, probably about the equivalent of $350,000. And that just didn't make sense to me. And that's sort of how I got interested in it. I thought this just seems wrong. And it sort of went on from there. And over the years, I've always taken an interest in the case. And I finally got round to it as a serious subject about 4 or 5 years ago, when there was an exhibition in Paris. And they released for the exhibition quite a few of the documents that are in the Paris Police Archives in Paris relating to the case. And I looked at these and I realized that actually my original hunch about the case might just possibly be true. And that's where it took off.
What were some of the challenges you faced as you researched this book?
Well, I think the main challenge was the challenge they faced at the time, which is it's a tremendously complicated case. I mean, this man, he's a petty swindler. He's on the run from the law, and he goes, he flees the police just before the outbreak of the First World War, leaving a wife and 4 children in southern Paris, where he's his latest bolt hole. And over the course of the First World War and just afterwards, 10 women and the son of one of the women disappear at 2 country houses outside Paris. And the allegation is that Landru killed them. And also during that period, the police calculated that he was in contact romantically via Lonely Hearts adverts, matrimonial agencies and various other vehicles with 283 women. Well, that figure is wrong. It's actually more. You can figure that out from quite a lot of the documents that are buried in the Paris police archives. So that's a sort of first complexity, is that the police didn't even get that part right. I also think that it's fairly clear that the police were led to conclude that Landru had killed 11 individuals, 10 women and 1 young man, simply on the basis of a list that he kept in his carnet, his little notebook, very incriminating notebook, which they discovered when they arrested him. The trouble with it is that there's witnesses who were never called at his trial who saw some extremely suspicious things going on at the house where he lived in the country, foul smoke coming out of the chimney, and also comings and goings at a nearby pond, which suggest that actually he may well have killed more. In fact, I'm pretty sure that he did kill more, and that's what I say in the book. So you're dealing with different levels of complexity, and at the centre of it all is this extraordinary man who may well have been completely mad by the end of this, but this terrible odyssey, really. But it's another kind of conundrum, because he was declared fit to stand trial. So that was the challenge, and that was why I sort of explored the archives in the end with such relish, because in fact you can find, if you dig through all of this material for long enough, you can find answers to quite a few of the questions.
So these 10 women and 1 young man you've mentioned that he will eventually be tried for murdering all vanished between 1915 and 1919. Would you mind summarizing the circumstances of their disappearances, just in general, who these women were, what they had in common with each other, and what the things were that kind of tied their disappearances together?
Sure. I think the first thing I'd say is that the prosecution case tried to simplify everything by saying these women were all identical and Landru's motive was the same each time, that he was trying to steal their money and then kill them. Then he killed them in order to prevent them going to the police. The trouble with that thesis is that I reckon only 3 of the women were really rich enough to be targets for a marriage swindler, which is what Landru had been, among other things, before the war. 3 or 4 of the women were almost completely destitute. So you're already looking at differences between them. They all lived in Paris. They ranged in age from 19 was the youngest, she was easily the youngest, all the way to 55. So there's quite a big age range, and if one goes through them in terms of the women who were known to have disappeared, the first one was a seamstress, the second one was an unemployed governess, I guess you'd call her. The third did have a little bit of money, and she was a retired governess. The fourth was a cleaning woman. The fifth was a typist. The sixth was a nanny. She was the youngest. The seventh was a housekeeper. The eighth was a dressmaker. The ninth was a dressmaker, and the 10th was a prostitute. So they're mostly working class, or perhaps just on the fringes of middle class, but they range in terms of their income, in terms of their age. And I felt once one got into the pre-trial documents, they had very different personalities as well. Some of them had similarities, but they were all labelled at the trial as being typically, it's very chauvinist, typically foolish, vulnerable, silly women who were infatuated with Landru, and that is why they were targets, because he knew he could deceive them. In terms of how they disappeared, he rented 2 houses outside Paris consecutively. The first of them was in a little town called Vernouillet, which is probably about 20 miles west of Paris, by the Seine, by the River Seine. And he had this house from December 1914 to August 1915. And three of the women, the first three women on the murder charge sheet, were known to have disappeared there. How they disappeared is an interesting question. There was smoke that neighbours saw churning out of his chimney. Possibly he was seen, he had a little delivery van going back and forth, removing the bodies. But there's no real direct evidence, which is part of the problem here, which is that you're already in a situation where people, when they're interviewed years later, can't really remember. They remember him being very fishy. They thought he might have been a German spy, but they didn't really have any hard, conclusive evidence. He then ends the lease on that house, and he rents a house from December 1915 until his arrest in April 1919, outside a village called Gambay. And the house is called the Villa Trick, and it's about a mile outside Gambay in open country. The amazing thing is I was there a couple of weeks ago. It's still there. You can actually buy it if you want. It's on the market at the moment. But the house has really not changed at all. It was a sort of boxy, 2 up, 2 down house with a huge garden and outhouses at the back. And 7 of the women, the last 7 on the murder charge sheet, disappeared there from 1915 to 1919. And Landru's style, if that's it's a slightly tasteless way of putting it, but when he decides he's going to kill these women, they take a train from Paris, and he buys a train ticket, a return ticket for himself, and a one-way ticket for the women, and they don't come back to Paris. In his notebook, he again and again records the hour of the day when something happens, and it's not clear what is happening, but it happens to coincide with the time when the women vanish, really, in the sense that it's the last known sighting of them has been very close to that time. So the presumption of the prosecution was that he was noting the time in his diary, his notebook, because it was the hour of the murder. And when I say they disappear in this sense that nobody ever figured out how Landru had killed them, although I have fairly strong suspicion that he must have strangled them. There was no forensic evidence that could be tied directly to the women, although there were some charred fragments of bone, dubbed very, very small, discovered beneath a pile of leaves in an open shed at the end of his garden in the house called the Villa Trick at Gambay. And the police scoured the house and grounds. They drained or half drained a nearby pond, but they never found anything. So that is why the women were called in French les disparus, the disappeared, because they had just vanished. And that was another thing that the police had to tackle when they came to investigate Landru.
Why do you think it might have been strangulation?
Well, I think you can see when you go to the first house, the one in Vernouillet, that it was really the only possible way he could have killed them without alerting the neighbours, because the house is it's a strange house. It's a sort of double-fronted house, but it's on a residential street, and he's got neighbours on either side, and if he'd used a gun, they would have heard the sound of gunshot. No question about that. So I think that rules out shooting them. I think it also, there were theories that he might have poisoned them. They found a book of famous poisoners in a flat he rented later after his arrest. They found it, but I think that that was quite a risky way to try and kill the women, because there was always the possibility of a struggle, and it's possible, but I think it's less likely than strangulation. The circumstantial evidence that he strangled them is that he did definitely strangle 3 pet dogs that had belonged to the last of his victims, the prostitute, and also earlier on a cat, and their remains were found in the garden at Gombe. So he said at his trial, rather creepily, that strangulation, in relation to the dogs, he never admitted anything else. He said that strangulation was the gentlest of deaths. So I think that's probably his murder method.
I'd like to ask you about motive as well. What do you think prompted him to kill some of these women, the ones he wouldn't have reaped any financial reward from after their deaths?
Yeah, well, this is where I think it gets really complicated, because I think that there was a whole question. I think perhaps one has to preface this with the whole question about Landru's state of mind, because he had been. I'll rewind the tape a little bit and come back to to your question, because he had been a petty swindler, not a very successful one before the war, and in 1904, he was examined by 3 psychiatrists, top psychiatrists. They weren't quacks, after he faked a suicide attempt while he was awaiting trial for various frauds and swindles. It didn't seem like a serious suicide attempt, which is why they called in the psychiatrists. And one of them concluded that he was, quote, on the frontiers of madness, but he had not yet crossed the frontier. This psychiatrist felt sufficiently alarmed, though, by Landru's behaviour that he warned his wife to be on guard about what he might do in future. The 2 other psychiatrists at the time endorsed that view. I guess in English you'd say he was a borderline case. They couldn't really decide whether he was insane, and there was a lot of pressure at the time for criminals not to be sent to a lunatic asylum if they could possibly be put on trial. Now, if you fast forward 15 years to his arrest in 1919, the same psychiatrists, exactly the same, come back to examine him, and it's a very strange report that they produce, because there's almost no evidence they use to support their clinical judgment. But they say that he is, in fact, completely responsible for his actions and mentally fit to stand trial, almost making it sound as if their previous diagnosis was wrong. Now, going back to his motives, what I found most difficult, I decided that he had crossed the frontiers of madness, but I think one can, in the end, find a connecting thread. And it's not to do with money, although he's an opportunist. I mean, if there is money to be stolen, of course he'll steal it. And I think sometimes with 1 or 2 of the women, that probably was his prime motive. But the one connecting thread that comes through all of this is his misogyny. He's out to get women. He despises women, and he says all sorts of terrible things both before and after his trial about how women are just there to be obeyed. And when women come to testify against him at his trial, he says to the jury, don't listen to these cackling hens. He hates and despises women, and I think that he likes to punish them. He does awful things, like there's a poor woman who answers a Lonely Hearts advert. It's the 5th of his alleged victims, and she makes the mistake of lying about her true age. She's actually 55, and she pretends in her reply that she's, say, 45. And he realizes as soon as he sees her that she's lied. And I think it's pretty clear, because she had absolutely no money, that he just decides to humiliate and then punish her and then kill her. So there's a sort of vengeance going on. There's something he's working out of his system where that is the first sort of side of it, which is the misogyny. The other thing that is quite clear is that he has a ferocious sex drive. I mean, he is trawling for women the whole time, which is why I think it's pretty clear once you go dig into the documents that there were many, many more than 283 women, because he Those are the ones that the police found in written records, answers to Lonely Hearts adverts, registered at matrimonial agencies, and then from the files that he kept on women at the garage he had in a Paris suburb called Clichy. But all the time he's picking up women on the metro, on buses. Even hours before his arrest, he leaves his apartment where his current mistress is sleeping, and he goes down into the metro and he picks up another woman and arranges a rendezvous. She's probably a prostitute for the following week. So I think that in the end, that's what it is. It's about sex and power, and it's about a really deeply, deeply mad man at large in a city and a countryside that was largely unpoliced because of the war. All the policemen were away at the front, and to some extent, I think you could say that Landru was hiding in plain sight, because depressingly, a lot of his own attitudes were sort of a warped version of the kind of views that French men had about what they called the feeble sex at the time.
Could you describe his physical appearance? Was he a man women were automatically attracted to? Was he charismatic? I mean, what was the attraction?
Well, this is difficult because most of the photographs of Landru were taken at the trial in 1921 after he had been in prison for 2.5 years and had variously. So he'd starved himself at various times, and he looked extraordinary because he was haggard. He had a grey beard. He was completely bald, and the journalists just couldn't see how this man could possibly have done what he did. And in my book, I use a photograph taken of Landru, actually not very much earlier, when he was just in his late 40s in 1918. And he goes to the theatre with his girlfriend, his mistress, Fernande, and he's wearing a dinner jacket and a bow tie. And you can see, when you see him then, when he's sort of still well-nourished, that he had possibly a certain something about him. I mean, he was muscular, he was short, he had a beard, he was bald. It's very difficult stuff to write about if you're a man, I think, because he must have had something about him. There must have been some sort of something about his sexuality which attracted some women, because in the files that the police collected on him, there was testimony from women who had clearly, as happened in wartime, were looking for sexual adventure and had encountered Landru and then had a terrible time trying to sort of say, well, actually, we didn't really do anything, when clearly something had happened. So I think that was one side of it. I think the other thing that is quite interesting is that Landru, of course, he didn't need to be that attractive to attract women during the war, because this was a country that was just denuded of young men. They were all away at the front. I mean, if you bear in mind that the generation of Frenchmen who were born between 1891 and 1895, more than a quarter of them, 28%, were wiped out during the First World War. So you have to imagine in Paris and other cities that it's a marriage swindler's paradise, really, because there are no young men around. And if you're somebody like Landru, who is just above the age where he would have had to go and at least be enlisted in the military reserves, there's a lot of opportunity. So I think that's the other side of the equation. He also had, to some extent, the gift of the gab. I mean, he'd been quite well educated. He was educated but in a Catholic school run by monks. He had a pretty good vocabulary. He knew how to write sort of flowery letters. So he had all of that side of things. But I wouldn't say at the end of it that meant that he was a sort of an Adonis. He certainly wasn't. I mean, he was short. Markedly short, and he didn't really. I think as time went by, he became more and more weird. Really, I mean, he became more obviously mad. So I think by the end, he'd probably lost, just before his arrest, he'd probably lost most of that. There's certainly a lot of evidence that women are beginning to see through him in the last sort of 6 months before his arrest.
I suppose when you make the focus of your life seducing women, you become pretty good at it after a while.
Yeah, I mean, he pulls the same trick again and again, which is to, I mean, one of the things he does, which is quite cunning, is he is always, I mean, he's clever at doing Lonely Hearts adverts. I mean, the amazing thing with the internet is you can actually read the originals of these Lonely Hearts adverts, most of them, because they're digitized and they're up there on the website, the National Library's website, which is quite a creepy experience. But what you also see when you look at it is that he's very good at pitching himself, because there's the first, actually, I think it was the second that he placed in May 1915 in this newspaper called Le Journal, which had a huge readership of about 1 million people. And Landru pitches it just right, because there's somebody in who's just above his notice who says, "Oh, I have a chateau, I have this, I have that." I mean, he's obviously lying, this guy. And then Landru says, I'm single, I'm a widower, I've got savings of, a few savings, but not so much that you would think he's lying, but just enough to attract women, which I think is the other thing, by the way, which is that they were looking for financial security, a sort of sugar daddy who was going to look after them. So he's good at pitching it like that, and then he sort of does variations, like he says, "Yes, I've got, I'm a businessman over in Paris, but I live in Tunisia in the French colonies." Well, if you're in Paris during the First World War, you might quite like the idea of getting away to Tunisia with this successful businessman and getting away from the war. So he has cunning little ruses like that to trap women. He's pretty good at it at that level.
So he's a serial killer, and I know that in the case of many serial killers, there are signs early on, even during childhood, small signs, things escalating gradually over time. What were his early years like? Did he have some sort of traumatic experience with a woman that might have shaped this misogynistic attitude towards the female gender?
Well, I mean, here we come to he's married with 4 children, I mean, which is a whole other story in itself. And if one goes all the way back to the beginning, he's born in 1869 on the Ile de la Cité, which is basically where Notre Dame, well, he literally is born opposite Notre Dame, right in the centre of Paris. And he goes to school on the neighbouring island, which is the Ile Saint-Louis, these 2 islands in the middle of the Seine. And his father is a furnace stoker, and the family are deeply devout Catholics. And he's educated at the church school on the Ile Saint-Louis, and he becomes an altar boy, and then he becomes a subdeacon. And one day at Mass, a young woman in the audience, in the pews, her eye alights on him, or so she says. And anyway, they become lovers. And this is his wife, who is also from a deeply devout family. She's a laundress. And in terms of Landru's early career, it's almost a case that you have to decide who you're going to believe, because his wife, after his arrest, gives a long interview to, in fact, Le Journal, the same newspaper I just mentioned, and her account is that he was a loving, faithful husband in the early years of the marriage, and then things went wrong because he was defrauded by somebody, and he became an inventor, and then he went completely mad, and he was in and out of jail, and she suffered, and she had to bring up her 4 children, scrimping a living as a laundress. Now, what she left out of that interview, of course, is the fact that come the First World War, she also does various things like forge the signatures of several of the women who have disappeared so Landru can get his hands on the women's money from their bank accounts. So she's a tainted witness. This is a very roundabout answer to whether he had some traumatic experience. She would say that he just went bad. That was his wife's view. And in the end, she divorced him and washed her hands of him. Landru, when he was asked to describe his early life by the psychiatrists, he wrote a little memoir, heavily edited by the psychiatrist. It's very frustrating. But he does talk about, if you're talking about trauma, having 2 or 3 really very serious accidents where he hit his head against a chimney breast while he was at school as a little boy. He had another serious head injury when he was doing military service, and a little later he claimed, which I couldn't quite believe, that while he was fixing a car and he was underneath the engine, the car was winched up with a jack, and the jack had broken and the car had fallen on his head. I don't think that's true, but clearly he thought that all his problems were to do with being hit on the head. I found no evidence, none at all, of Landru having some sort of traumatic experience with a woman. There is evidence, and they tried, of mental problems in his own family. I mean, his father committed suicide in 1912 by hanging himself from a tree in the Bois de Boulogne, and this was actually when Landru was still in jail. And it's possible, therefore, that this is Landru had some sort of genetic mental illness, and that was the sort of cause of his problems. But as to his really vicious misogyny, I couldn't find anything sort of specific in his previous life. I did find something after he went on the run, which I think would explain what tilted him over from being just a sort of common swindler into being somebody going on the rampage against women in this really hateful fashion. I'd rather not say what it is, because it's the hook at the end of my book. Because I think that is what the police missed when they were trying to figure out why it had all happened, and what in the end was the trigger that had unleashed the horror. But it's there.
So you mentioned earlier that the big reason this case broke open was due to the tenacity of a sister of one of his victims. She did everything she could to find her missing sister. Can you tell the story about how she pieced things together and was eventually able to point the police towards Landru?
Which, I mean, to me, one of the most amazing aspects of the whole story, which is by far and away the best detective in the whole case, was a housemaid living in Paris whose elder sister had disappeared at Gambay in 1917. And this housemaid, she's called Marie Lacoste. She was suspicious of Landru, whom she met quite a few times with her sister right from the beginning. She thought he was a swindler. And the trouble was that she only thought he was a swindler. She didn't think he was a murderer. And she visited Gambay with her elder sister just before her elder sister disappeared, and she basically snooped around the house and the gardens when Landru was not there. He had to do a trip back to Paris. And I think she came very, very close to actually discovering the real horror of what was going on there, because she actually tried to see through the keyhole of a locked shed in the garden, and she could see bundles or packages, it seemed, in the gloom, but she couldn't make out any more. And not long after that, during the same visit, she had a huge row with her sister when she discovered that Landru, who they knew as Frémier, Monsieur Frémier, had been taking, with her sister's permission, draining her bank account, all the savings in her bank account. And the two sisters had this huge row. They parted company. She never saw her sister again. But what then happens is that about a year later, I'm truncating the story a little, but about a year later, and this is just after the end of the First World War, her elder sister's son, who is blind, he was blinded during the war and invalided out of the army, and is living in southwest France. He has had an accident. He's written to his mother. He can't get a reply. And he writes instead to the maid and says, could you go round, because I'm really in desperate trouble. I need to talk to my mother. And the maid goes round to where she thinks her sister is living in this apartment and discovers that the apartment is empty and that her elder sister has not been there, in fact, for more than a year. And she puts two and two together, and she realizes that Landru, the man she knows as Fremier, has killed her sister, almost certainly. And at that point, she proves herself to be a real sleuth, because she pieces together in a dossier every single thing she can remember about Landru's movements with her sister, about where they had lived, what they did, what the house looked like, a description of him, what he got up to. And it's a very, very well organized piece of research by a not well-educated housemaid with not much time to do it, because of course she's working the whole time with maybe just half a day off a week. And as soon as she's done this, she goes to the police, and the first thing the police officer says to her, this is in Paris, is, I can't help you, because actually the case, these women, your sister disappeared down in Gambé, you have to go to the authorities there. And so she writes this letter, and it's really very moving, because she writes to the mayor of Gambé in a sort of semi-literate letter, but with all the information that the mayor needed to go and investigate the house and the grounds, except for the fact that she says that the man's name is Fremier. And the mayor writes a very sort of disingenuous reply back, saying, we don't know anybody called Fremier, and indeed he said, we'd never heard of your sister either. Well, that was true, but they did know exactly who she was talking about, because they knew the man. This is the mayor and the village school teacher who was the mayor's secretary. They knew him as Dupont. So they'd been very economical with the truth. The one thing that the mayor did do was say to add a note to the maid, saying that there had been another woman, sister of another who had written to him, saying that her own sister had disappeared and could he investigate. And the mayor gives the housemaid the address of this woman. They join forces and they file a joint complaint, and to cut a very long story short, they force the police to investigate, and it eventually lands on the desk of a very lazy policeman, detective in Paris, Jules Bellin, who is incompetent and a liar and also actually a misogynist. And he does some very desultory inquiries and then writes up a report which just lifts all the research that the housemaid has done and claims it as his own. And he sort of gives up. And it's just at this point that another maid who works in the same house, who has seen Landru because he has come calling at this house because he's worried about Marie Lacoste, the amateur detective, because she's after him. This other maid, by chance, spots Landru shopping in a crockery shop on the Rue de Rivoli in Paris, and she follows him out of the shop, and he's with another woman, and unfortunately she gets on the bus, and then she thinks he's recognized her, so she gets off again, and she runs back home, tells Marie, and Marie, the maid, she's got the phone number of the policeman, she calls the policeman goes back to the shop, gets the card, the business card that Landru has left for delivery of this crockery, finds the address, realizes that the name is actually Guillet, not Fremier, which is the name on the arrest warrant, and so the policeman goes home. And he comes back eventually the following day with the correct name on the arrest warrant, and he arrests Landru. But in the end, it's the maid who gets him arrested with the help of her friend, the other maid. It isn't the police, who are really throughout the case completely out of their depth. So it's actually quite a heroic story if you consider the odds that were against any woman really at that time, pursuing a pretty terrifying man with the police not at all willing to help her.
Yes, and the obvious irony of all of this is that the housemaid, who basically finds the murderer single-handedly, is working against all of these sexist men who believe that women are inferior to them.
But exactly, and I think that, I mean, I was actually quite slow off the mark with this because at the trial, which is this tremendous set-piece event, it lasts for 3.5 weeks, and everybody who's anybody is there. Maurice Chevalier goes, Colette, the novelist, covers the case as a journalist on the first day. Believe it or not, Rudyard Kipling is there for one of the days. He was passing through Paris, and I think somebody just took him down to watch it. And Landru's lawyer, I know this sounds off the point, but I'll come back to explain what I mean. I mean, he's the greatest lawyer in France. He's called Vincent de Moreau-Giaferi, and his whole game is to try and make Landru shut up and to turn the whole case into a quest to save Landru from the guillotine. And Moreau doesn't even question the fact that Landru has stolen from these women, and he knows, and he lets the jury know, that Landru is anyway going to be destined for a penal settlement probably in Guyana, French Guyana in the Caribbean, where he would have been killed effectively very soon because the regime was so harsh. But Moreau passionately believes that there isn't sufficient evidence for Landru to go to the guillotine. And the case he constructs is that all these women were basically sluts. They were all loose, immoral women who were possibly all prostitutes, or certainly sort of close to being prostitutes. One was definitely a prostitute. And so it's actually a tremendously misogynistic case in itself. And what he's really asking the jury to believe is he's doing a kind of devil's bargain with the jury, which is to say, except, I will say to you that he stole from them. He was a pimp. He basically traded them into the white slave trade. He actually says that and makes that the most likely hypothesis for what happened to these women. In return, for basically offering you that, you cannot send Landru to the guillotine because there isn't enough evidence that, there's no certainty that he killed these women. So it is a very, very misogynistic case. And it actually, in the end, it took me a long time to realize that it wasn't about that Moreau was sort of trying to steal the show, but actually the real story was about the misogyny and about both Landru's hatred of women and about this terrible atmosphere that the women had to endure who came to testify against Landru at the trial, where the coverage of the trial was some of it was almost pornographic. I mean, there's one reporter in the audience who sees a young actress taking her seat in the gallery, and he writes, gosh, wouldn't it be great if she played one of Landru's victims and one could see her burnt naked on stage? I mean, he actually says that. And there are other really sort of disgusting things that the newspapers do. So the whole trial is just drenched in misogyny, and Landru took advantage of that by claiming all the rights of a man and sort of saying to the jury that you just don't want to listen to these women who are coming to testify against me because they're women. They're just making it up. So in the end, that was the sort of, to me, the strongest thing that came out.
There's little to no physical evidence, but lots of testimony against him on the witness stand. Do you think it was the testimony of these women that ultimately swayed the jury to the verdict of guilty? What was the determining factor?
Well, I feel in the end, and I wrote this, that this was a case in the end that was decided by the heart, not the head. And what I meant really was that it was just draining, wrenchingly emotional testimony. And the jury was sort of left with a choice. They could either use their heads, if you like, and say, well, look, the evidence that he'd stolen from them was overwhelming. I mean, the only person who protested his innocence about the thefts was Landru himself. The evidence of murder was pretty strong. Was it conclusive? And that was a very, very difficult one to answer. I think if you were actually looking for that level of proof, that level of certainty, as the defense lawyer said, it didn't pass the test, particularly because the prosecution case was so absurd. I mean, almost certainly he did kill them, but you couldn't be absolutely sure. And, his neck was on the line, literally. But in French law, you only needed what they, in French it was an intimate conviction. You had to know in your heart, your conscience had to tell you that this man deserved to die. And I felt that actually, in the end, the trial hinged on various very, very emotional pieces of testimony by women who had no evidence that he had killed the women, killed their sisters or their daughters, or mostly they were relatives or female friends of the missing women. They had no direct evidence, but they did have the sort of testimony of what Landru had done to their sisters in terms of everything that had happened before they disappeared, the awful kind of humiliation of them and terrible duplicity and just cruelty, really. And I felt myself, but it's purely subjective, that I think that in the end, the defense lost the case. Moreau, the lawyer, lost the case quite early on when the sister of the first of the missing women, she was asked by Moreau to describe a dream that she'd had about her missing sister. And the point Moreau was going to make, I'm sure, was that she's just made it up. This just proves that she's a fantasist. There's no evidence for this dream. But she tells the dream, and she talks about her sister coming to visit her in the night, and her neck is bleeding. And the Philomene, the witness, says, how did you do that? And her sister says, well, it was Landru who did it. He cut my throat. And the sister says, did it hurt in the dream? And the sister who's gone missing says, no, I was sleeping. At which point, the woman describing the dream just breaks down and says, oh, my sister, my poor, poor sister. And she's in tears. And Moreau says nothing more. He does not continue the cross-examination because he knows that he's blown it, because you're looking at this poor woman, bereaved, miserable, and you cannot not pity her and hate Landru at the same time. And I think in the end, that was what lost the case for the defense. It was the emotion, not the evidence. But it took a long time.
As Landru was sitting in the courtroom, watching, listening to all of this hostile testimony, what was his disposition? I mean, how did he handle all of this? Obviously, the jury was watching how he reacted to what was going on.
Well, he was uncontrollable, and that was part of the problem that the defense lawyer had. And also, he had a right to silence, but he didn't really have that right, because in French law, the judge, the presiding senior judge, examines the defendant and sort of tests the evidence before the prosecuting lawyer or the defense attorney have their go. And the judge was a pretty clever lawyer, and he got Landru talking too much. And in particular, Landru kept saying, when he was asked what had happened to the women, he kept saying, instead of just saying, I don't know, I haven't the faintest idea, which was the obvious answer, he kept saying, I have a kind of sacred contract, it's all private, I can't talk about it, sort of creating the impression that he knew something that he just wasn't at liberty to reveal, which was disastrous for the defense, because the prosecution, of course, made him repeat this 11 times because there were 11 victims, and he had different variations on it. But that was the first thing that Landru did in court, which was a disaster. His behavior was very volatile. Sometimes he would erupt. He had a very caustic temper, and he would yell across at the prosecuting attorney, I wish I only, my head is at stake. I wish I had an extra head to offer you. You're so bloodthirsty, and all sorts of things like that. The best thing from the defence lawyer's point of view was when Landru, who liked playing the attorney himself, he got buried in these notes that he made. He had these colour-coded dossiers, and he insisted on having all the documents from the case in his cell, which if literally true would have meant that he would have had 7,500 pages of documents in his cell, because it was the case had the paperwork had just swollen by then. And he would sit for hours on end, scribbling these notes, as if he was sort of basically being his own defence attorney. And nothing came of it. I mean, this was to me a very sure sign of his madness, that he was completely absorbed in this. And sometimes people would look at him and they would think, well, he's just like a kind of a clerk or something like that, because he wore a bowler hat. He had this rather sort of odd tunic he wore, but he had a bow tie, and he looked quite respectable, and he could be quite calm. And then he would erupt, and you'd say, well, no, actually, there's something pretty odd about him. And when he was really at full pelt, with this grey beard and sort of bushy eyebrows, completely bald, hectoring the jury and the court about this and that, he did look completely mad. So he was always great entertainment, which is why people came again and again to the trial. The audience built so that by the end, in a courtroom of probably a capacity of about 220, one journalist reckoned there were more than 500 in the court by the end. The judge completely lost control of the trial, and they were spilling over into the well of the court. All over, women were perched up on the window. You can see that in some of the photographs, and it was bedlam. But all the time, I mean, Landru was this extraordinarily charismatic figure at the centre of everybody's attention.
So he makes a drawing while in jail, right? That some people will later believe is the closest thing to a confession he'll ever make. It's a picture of his kitchen. Is that right?
Well, no, what he did was actually, you're right. I mean, it was during the trial. So while he was in jail, he drew a picture. He had been briefly in his youth an architect's clerk, so he knew how to draw. He draws a picture of this notorious little oven in his kitchen at the house at Gambé, which allegedly was where he burnt some of the remains of the women he had killed, although no bones were ever found, no human remains were ever found in this oven. And he gives, before his execution, he gives the picture for safekeeping to the assistant defence lawyer. And the picture has a sort of caption on it where one of the witnesses, a woman, had said, he'd said to one of the women he'd invited down there, who survived, by the way, boasting about his oven, that you can burn anything in there. And he was throwing in meat scraps and all the rest of it. And Landru writes this very, very cryptic message beneath this quote, saying that, and I'm afraid to say, right now, I can't remember quite how he put it, but it was ambiguous, and he said it wasn't what happened in front of the wall; it's what happened what mattered was what happened behind the wall, which kind of got people thinking when this drawings resurfaced decades later after the assistant defence lawyer died. His daughter produced it on French television. And people thought, well, this must be some sort of clue that Landru is giving about what had really gone on at Gambé. I think it was actually just another indication of Landru's madness, that it just amused him to sort of set up something that was a red herring or a false trail. So it wasn't like that kind of moment where there was a breakthrough because of the drawing. It was more that the drawing created even more kind of obscurity and ambiguity surrounding the case.
So what happens to Landru after he's convicted? He doesn't have much time, does he?
Well, it's very bizarre because what you have to imagine is this tumultuous scene in the courtroom where hundreds and hundreds of people, and he has just been sentenced to death by a majority only of the jury, find him guilty of the murders. So it's 9-3. But they then bizarrely unanimously signed the appeal for clemency, which would have got Landru saved Landru from the guillotine, it would have sent him to the penal settlement in French Guyana. And Landru refuses to sign the appeal for clemency, insisting that since he's innocent, he doesn't need to do it, which has a certain sort of logic to it, I suppose. And he basically goes into a kind of funk in his cell for several weeks after the sentence. He is persuaded eventually to sign the clemency appeal. And so this is November, it's December 1921. And gradually the whole thing sort of grinds through the French legal judicial system, and it goes to the President of France, which is how it worked in those days. And Moreau goes to plead for Landru's life, really, with the President of France, and he fails. And so Landru is due to be executed the next morning, just outside the gates of the prison in Versailles, which was actually next to the courtroom as well. It's rather creepy because you can actually just stand on the spot, and you know exactly where it is because it was 3.5 meters, according to French law, directly outside the prison gates. Now, what Landru hears overnight, he shouldn't have been told that he was going to be executed, but he does hear, and he also hears that the prosecuting attorney is not going to be present. And this outrages Landru, and he sits down and writes this extraordinary letter to the prosecuting attorney, insisting on his innocence again, saying to the prosecuting attorney that he could tell just by looking into his eyes during the trial that even the prosecuting attorney knew that he was innocent and that he'd been caught out by Landru's neat answers. And it goes on and on. How that he couldn't have possibly burnt the women in the oven because it was just like a children's oven. And this letter, which a newspaper managed to get hold of, it's pages and pages. So it must have taken him most of the night. And then you have this scene, which is, all executions are pretty macabre, but I think Landru's is up there with some of the most sort of extraordinary executions, because the whole thing is not well choreographed. He gets up, and his defense lawyer is there and various other people, and he has his morning sort of toilette where he combs his beard because he's very proud of his beard. He's then taken to the prison registry office, where, of course, the beard gets cut to shreds by the prison barber. He's offered the ritual rum and a cigarette, and he declines both because he one of the sort of peculiar things about Landru was that he was pretty much a teetotaler and he didn't smoke. And he's got enough self-possession at that point to say those two things. And he's just about to be marched out, hands tied behind his back, to the guillotine, when they have to stop it because they'd forgotten to notify the transport company, and the morning tram line with the workers runs straight past the guillotine, and a tram is heading up. It's late, and the driver refuses to stop and wait for the execution. So they all have to stop to let this tram go past the guillotine with these workers jeering over the prison wall at Landru, and it carries on. Finally, the gates open and Landru emerges, and he's actually caught. It's not in my book, but an artist sketches him just as he's about to be slammed on the guillotine, and it's a most extraordinary picture because he's had his beard shaved off. He looks understandably kind of absolutely terrified, and the two men behind him, they look like a rather sinister Laurel and Hardy act because they were wearing bowler hats. One was thin and the other was fat. I mean, it's the most extraordinary picture. He's put on the guillotine is locked, at which point the two assistants withdraw, and normally what would happen is that the blade would drop. It would all be over in an instant. Now, for some reason, that didn't happen, and one journalist, then they were kept back behind a barricade, but he could see enough, and he reckoned there was an interval of 7 seconds before the blade dropped. Now, whether that was because there was some problem with the mechanism, or whether, as I think, France's chief executioner, Monsieur Deibler, was rather relishing the moment, is an open question. But it was a pretty kind of horrible end to a horrible life. And he is then buried in a cemetery in Versailles, in an unmarked grave. Eventually, it's a sort of pauper's grave initially, and then the family refused to renew it, and he's just reburied elsewhere, somewhere in this absolutely huge cemetery, and nobody really knows where he is.
I'd really like to know more about your theory that there were more women killed by Landru than those 10 he was convicted for killing.
Yeah.
I'd love to ask you about that. How did you go about researching this? I mean, did you check to see if other women in the area during these years had gone missing too, and try to connect him in some way geographically?
No, it was more specific. It was actually the other way round, because I think that what happened was they discovered the notebook very soon on, immediately after his arrest, and they found this list of 11 individuals, 10 women, one young man, and they were all names or code names, which were pretty easy to decode, because once witnesses started coming forward, you could see who these people had been. And so they were able to get very precise information, which they could collate with the notebook about when these women had disappeared and how they married up with the names in the notebook. So there was a sort of timeline that the case had, that these women had disappeared at certain times. Here was the notebook. Therefore, this must be the sum total of the murders. Now, the problem is that there are several problems, but the main one, I think, is that there were several witnesses who had seen very, very suspicious things: smoke coming out of Landru's house, packages being dropped in the middle of the night in the pond near Gambé. And the problem was that these were very, very good witnesses, but they had seen these incidents at times which did not match the disappearances in the notebook and the chronology of the prosecution case. So they were discounted. And there was one in particular, a doctor, who was bicycling back to his barracks, actually, during the First World War. And he sees smoke, and it's a very precise, very detailed witness statement, and he sees smoke coming out of Landru's house. This is in the evening, foul-smelling smoke, and he puzzles about it for a bit, and then he carries on, and then he gets a puncture riding past this pond deep in the forest, and he's mending his puncture, and he sees, obviously, Landru coming along in this distinctive tradesman's van that he drove, getting out of the car. Landru doesn't see the doctor, with a great heavy package over his shoulder, disappearing on the far side of the pond behind a clump of reeds and dropping the package in the water. The trouble with the doctor's testimony is not that it's wrong, it's just that it happens at the wrong time. 6 months after one of the known women had disappeared, and 6 months before another of the known women had disappeared. So that's the first problem with the notebook. The second problem with the notebook is he didn't buy it until after the first woman had disappeared, and he didn't start taking detailed notes in it until more than a year after he acquired it. Not only that, but you can actually find from various bits of testimony, one woman in particular at the same pond near Gambé, that he didn't note everything in his notebook. So it's not a comprehensive log of his movements. And you then come back to this question about why did he write the list? It's pretty clear to me that he must have written the list after the last of the known women, the 11th victim on the charge sheet, disappeared, because it is a list that is clearly written in one go, in the same handwriting on the same page. And I think that what Landru was doing, and this was shortly before he was arrested, was trying to remember what he had done, which is not, of course, the same thing as being able to remember what he had done, because he complained a lot about his memory and forgetting things, which is, of course, the standard defense of a con man. They always do that. But I think in Landru's case, there was possibly some truth to it, because if you consider what he had done and what he was known to have done, which was to pursue hundreds of women, rent flats, apartments all around Paris, lockups, garages, maintain a wife and 4 children, all the while he's on the run from the police anyway from previous convictions, and he's charging around, never stopping for about 5 years. He wouldn't necessarily have remembered everything. And I think that the awful truth is that actually murder had become such a sort of banal event to him that he was remembering in the list the most memorable ones, which was not necessarily all the ones that he had done. I'm pretty sure that was the case. So that's the sort of logic of it. And I think it is, one cannot say at the end he definitely killed more than the 11 on the charge sheet, but I think it is much more likely that he did than that he didn't.
That's some pretty impressive sleuthing there on your part.
I got obsessed, and I got obsessed particularly because the police were so lazy. I mean, I think what happened with the police was that the list made it easy for them, and they were under-resourced. I mean, there's no question about that. It was the end of the First World War. A lot of the policemen were hadn't been demobilized, and it was a very, very complicated case. But the list made it easy if all they were trying to do was send Landru to the guillotine. It was sort of like theory-laden observation. Here's the list. Here are the women. That's all we need to do. The thing is that the police were also liars, because they gave the impression, which then became sort of an assumed fact, that they had traced every single woman that they knew about, all 283. And that meant some of them had died, but not died in suspicious circumstances. They'd been able to explain all those women, what had happened to them, apart from these 10 missing women and the one young man. The trouble is that actually in the Paris police archives, buried in the wrong file, amid thousands and thousands of documents, there is a kind of balance sheet that the police drew up, where they state quite emphatically that they had failed to trace 72 of the women out of the 283 of the total that they had. Now, that doesn't mean that Landru killed 72, but it does mean that the police really knew much, much less about Landru than they claimed.
That's just really interesting. I know that this story is not one known necessarily on a global scale, but there still have been a number of film adaptations of this. Are there any that you find especially entertaining or well done? Which one sticks with the historical facts most closely?
Well, the short answer to that is no. The interesting thing is in France, Landru is as well known as Jack the Ripper in England, or Christie, or say in America, H.H. Holmes. I was on a metro when I was on a research trip in Paris, and I gave up my seat for an old lady, and we got chatting because I like to practice my French, and she said, "Well, what are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing a book about Landru." And she said, "Did he do it?" I mean, she knew, it's that sort of thing. It's part of everyday culture. Films about Landru. Well, there's one which is quite an interesting story, which is nothing with Landru is simple, but Orson Welles heard about Landru, and shortly after Citizen Kane, when he was at the height of his biddability or his spending power as a producer because of the success of Citizen Kane, he did what seems to have been a sort of treatment of the Landru story. And he had this sort of Orson Welles-like idea of casting Charlie Chaplin sort of against type as Landru. It's a very vague, murky story, but Chaplin took the idea, seems to have paid Wells some money, and turned it into a film that eventually came out under the title Monsieur Verdoux, just after the Second World War, 1947. And in it, he plays this bank clerk who has lost his job and needs to support his family, and kills 14 wealthy widows. I think it's 14. It's a travesty of the original plot, but it is the original story, but it is loosely based on Landru. And actually, it's quite a good film, but it's not a good film for the reason that it is remotely faithful to Landru. It's just that it's quite a good dark comedy. The French director, Claude Chabrol, he produced a film about Landru in 1963, which was an abomination. I mean, it is actually an abomination because he completely ignored the story, but sort of tried to pass it off as true. And the women were all reinvented as sort of elegant Parisian ladies, when of course they weren't like that. The script was by the French novelist Françoise Sagan, and Landru's last mistress, who had wanted to be a star herself, she actually sued Chabrol because she saw her own portrayal by Chabrol's then girlfriend, future wife, Stéphane Audran, a very, very famous French film star who died recently. And she couldn't bear it because Stéphane Audran was everything she had wanted to be. She was a star, sexy, and Landru's former mistress, now an old woman, she sued, and she did get some damages, not as much as she wanted, but it's a very sad story because she retires to an old people's home, and a few years later, whether because she can't get over Landru, because she maintained for the rest of her life that she was still in love with him, or perhaps possibly because she was quite ill, she committed suicide. But those are the two most famous films. There are others. There's another one in France which is just called Landru, which was a kind of schlock horror TV movie. So from time to time, there have been films about Landru. I don't myself think that any of them have been particularly successful as a sort of representation of what happened.
I would think that a film adaptation, hopefully of your book, through the eyes of the sister who helped solve the crime, would be an especially compelling way to tell the story.
Well, I would too. So I'm open to offers. I think it has the makings of a great drama. I think I'm not a script writer, but I think the difficulty, the challenge is trying to sort of make sense of the complexity, so the reader or the viewer doesn't get lost. Which was one of the challenges I had in the book, was trying to sort of keep it simple, but on the other hand, not sort of make it simplistic. But yes, I do, and it is a tremendously dramatic. I mean, the drama of the trial is quite extraordinary because it is a sort of titanic struggle over things that are quite deep, like the death penalty. But it's also this extraordinary story of female vengeance as well, where these women are coming to testify against Landru and sort of trying to will him to the guillotine while he's protesting his innocence. So, it's great drama from that point of view. And that is why, of course, it was covered in such depth by the newspapers, because it sold newspapers. This was the great age of newspapers. And day after day, when there were all these other things going on, from the beginning of the investigation, there was a French newspaper who actually said that the government's just concocted this case because it's so much more interesting than having to follow the wretched performance of the government at the Paris peace talks. So it has every ingredient from that point of view.
So I'd like to ask you the question that the old woman you gave up your seat for asked you. Do you think he committed the murders?
I'm sure of that. I think what's much more troubling is the fact that I'm pretty sure that, in fact, I am sure that he killed more, and the question is how many more. And I think that's the most disturbing aspect of the case, is that one really doesn't know, and it could have been that he killed dozens more. He certainly had the opportunity because he was really, as I said, not really policed at all in any meaningful sense. So. Yeah, he was guilty. And I feel torn, and I sort of say this at the end of the book, that on the one hand, I really don't believe in the death penalty at all, in any circumstances. So I like to think that I would have voted with the minority on the jury to acquit him of the murder charges. safe in the knowledge that he was going to be killed anyway, because they would have sent him to a really hellish penal settlement, hard labour, and he wouldn't have survived that. But actually, when you sort of the testimony of the women who came in tears, most of them, to bear witness to what he'd done to their sisters or daughters is so moving, so heart-wrenching, and you hate Landru so much that I'm not so sure I wouldn't have actually voted, found him guilty in court, knowing that he'd have been sent to the guillotine.
I did an episode a while back about the Esbon serial killer.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a different war, a different country, but there are some similarities, especially the fact that all of these women were left in the city, Berlin in the case of the Esbon killer, Paris, of course, in your story, while the men have gone away to fight. And it's an absolutely perfect preying ground for a guy like this. He's got the city at his fingertips.
The police, I think they commonly do in cases like this, they build him up and they say, oh yeah, he was really strategic, he was cunning and devious, master of disguise and deception and all the rest of it. Actually, I don't think he was. I think he's remarkably casual, and he's obviously a very distinctive looking person anyway, and he just gets away with it because nobody's keeping an eye on him. I mean, one of the things, if it wasn't for the fact that he was a mass murderer, it would be quite funny. But the main attention he attracts from the very, very limited police forces down in Vernier and then Gambé. I mean, it's basically in both places, it's just some elderly local constable. But the main attention he attracts from the locals is the suspicion that he might be a German spy, because there was spy fever, in France at this time. And he certainly behaves very suspiciously, but it's a sort of curious thing that because all of that attention is on him as an enemy agent, nobody considers the possibility that actually he might be a killer. So I think he's sort of very much, it's a cliche, but he's hiding in plain sight. He seems more normal than he is because it's a very, very chauvinistic society. So the sort of views he has about women are pretty commonplace. And these poor women, their lives are not treated particularly seriously, in the sense that there are, hundreds of thousands of young Frenchmen losing their life every year at the front. Who cares about these women? They've if they've disappeared, so they've disappeared. And I think that was another side of it, why the police just didn't really feel it was worth investigating.
You've gotten some great reviews from UK newspapers. But what about France? Has the book been translated into French? Have you gotten feedback from people in France about your book?
We're in discussion, so we're hoping that the French language version of it will appear. I mean, it's the big event that is coming up is next April. It's the centenary of his arrest, and I think in France that's when there will be. I mean, there's never no interest in Landru, but there's a whole period between the centenary of his arrest and his trial where I think there are various events going to be coming up. So. Hopefully it will appear in French translation soon, which will be bad news for me because there's actually an awful lot of original material that I translated from the original French into English, which I will then have to put back into the original French. I'm looking forward to that.
Bad news on some level, but hopefully when it's all done, it will be of some benefit to you to have it in print in the country where his case is still so popular.
Yeah, indeed. And indeed, actually, there's also a pretty big English language market in France these days. I'm sure there are a lot of people in France who listen to Most Notorious.
Yeah, we do. We do have some listeners in France, yes.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah. So for people who want to learn more about you, your book, your other work, where can we direct them?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a website, but actually I'd also say that my previous book would have zero sales in America because it was about a Victorian cricketer. But if you Google me, and don't confuse me with the renegade British Secret Service agent of the same name. You will find me. I mean, I think that's the best thing to say is that if you go to the link on for the book on Amazon, you'll find me, and if you Google me as well. So I should have a website. You're right.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. It's really a marvelous book.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Again, I've been speaking to Richard Tomlinson, author of Landru's Secret, The Deadly Seductions of France's Lonely Hearts Serial Killer. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.